Navigating tensions, the South China Sea's complex maritime scenario. Introduction. In today's video, we delve into the intricate and high-stakes situation unfolding in the South China Sea, a region rife with strategic importance and complex geopolitical interests. Our focus is on various potential scenarios that could lead to hindered navigation in these contested waters, analyzing their likelihood and broader implications. From China's assertive maritime activities to the United States' strategic military responses, and the significant impact on global trade and politics, we will explore the multifaceted dynamics at play in this crucial maritime region. Join us as we unravel the layers of this ongoing geopolitical puzzle and assess its impact on international relations and maritime security. The situation of hindered navigation in the South China Sea. 1. Possible scenarios. We explore potential scenarios leading to hindered navigation in the South China Sea, assessing their likelihood and implications. Projected scenario, course of events. A. China's increased activities in the disputed South China Sea, especially around the Spratly Islands and key maritime boundaries, involve actively barring foreign fishing and survey vessels. These actions have led to sporadic encounters and collisions with maritime law enforcement vessels from various nations, at times escalating to the use of water cannons and small firearms. The absence of a maritime collision avoidance accord or a code of conduct between China and ASEAN countries elevates the risk of unintended large-scale armed conflicts in this strategically important region. B. In response to escalating tensions, the United States strategically deploys a naval fleet, including aircraft carriers, to key locations near the Philippines, in the Western Pacific and around the southwestern islands. This move aims to deter an escalation of armed conflict between China and other nations involved in the dispute. Reacting to this, China declares the waters within the first island chain in the South China Sea as an area denial zone, thereby limiting the passage of foreign vessels, especially VLCCs. China's declaration, citing environmental risks in case of attacks, signals a significant escalation in maritime tensions. C. As a result, shipping companies operating in the South China Sea must adopt enhanced safety measures for VLCCs. China provides naval escorts for its oil tankers, while simultaneously denying innocent passage rights within the disputed 9-line area to foreign naval ships, a stance that has international implications. D. VLCCs transporting crude oil from the Middle East to Japan, typically navigating through the Malacca and Singapore Straits and entering the South China Sea, now face the challenge of finding alternative routes due to these new maritime restrictions. E. China's stance that the South China Sea issues should be resolved among regional states, coupled with its actions that appear to counter the United States' influence, includes threats of taking unspecified actions in the area between the first and second island chains, effectively declaring it an anti-access zone. This move is interpreted as an effort to secure vital shipping routes for its oil tankers, considering that a significant portion of China's imported oil is transported by sea and arrives at ports along the South and East China Seas. A potential blockade of the Malacca Strait by the United States, as part of an offshore control strategy, would force China to reroute its oil tankers through alternative paths, necessitating control over key maritime areas. This strategic positioning places the Western Pacific, alongside the Philippine Islands and the Southwestern Islands, within China's declared anti-access zone inside the second island chain. Should VLCCs avoid the Malacca and Singapore Straits and opt for the Indonesian archipelago route, proceeding northward through the Western Pacific, they would navigate through what China considers its anti-access zone, potentially disrupting navigation due to heightened tensions between the US and China. 2. Choosing alternative routes to bypass the South China Sea. In light of the described scenario, identifying alternative sea lanes for VLCCs transporting crude oil from the Middle East to Japan becomes imperative. The traditional routes through the Malacca and Singapore Straits, now compromised by the area denial and anti-access zones, necessitate a re-evaluation of navigational strategies. Should China enforce the area denial zone within the first island chain and restrict VLCC passage, vessels bound for Japan would need to reroute through the Lombok Strait, entering the Indonesian archipelago, then proceeding through the Makassar Strait and heading north along the eastern side of the Philippines to reach the Pacific ports. In a more escalated scenario, where the area between the first and second island chains becomes an anti-access zone, even the Lombok Strait, Makassar Strait route would become unviable. Consequently, VLCCs destined for Japan would be required to detour south of Australia, entering the South Pacific, then navigating northward through the Western Pacific. This detour, via the Lombok Strait, adds about 1,000 nautical miles one way from Saudi Arabian ports to the Pacific ports of Japan. A diversion south of Australia would extend the journey by approximately 5,200 nautical miles. Such increased travel distances would result in delayed arrivals of oil shipments, necessitating the chartering of additional VLCCs to maintain an adequate supply. An extra 1,000 nautical miles would require approximately 10 more VLCCs, while an additional 5,200 nautical miles would demand around 50 more vessels. Given the dynamics of the global VLCC market, securing an additional 10 VLCCs may be feasible, but acquiring 50 would present a significant challenge. Therefore, if China's restrictions are confined to an area denial zone, Japan might still meet its oil requirements. However, with the effective implementation of an anti-access zone, Japan's ability to source oil solely from the Middle East becomes significantly more complex. Impacts of the detour. 1. Impact on shipping. The implications of acquiring additional VLCCs are crucial to consider. The cost of transporting crude oil through sea lanes is composed of charter rates, fuel costs, and insurance premiums. Initially, charter rates may spike due to the tight market conditions and sellers' market dynamics. However, these rates are expected to stabilize over time as supply and demand factors come into play. Preliminary estimates indicate that chartering costs for transporting crude oil from the Middle East via the Lombok Strait to Japanese Pacific ports could rise by about 14 billion yen in the initial 2 to 3 months. However, these costs are projected to gradually decrease, eventually stabilizing at an additional monthly expense of around 1.5 billion yen. Over a year, the total loss could amount to approximately 23 billion yen, translating to an added annual cost of 230 yen per person, a relatively modest economic impact in the broader context. If navigating through the Indonesian archipelago becomes impractical, the route south of Australia would present significant challenges in securing enough VLCCs, leading to the exploration of alternative crude oil sources. 2. Economic impact. Restricted navigation in the South China Sea could potentially trigger a surge in global crude oil prices. Historical events such as the First and Second Oil Crises, the Gulf War, and Hurricane Katrina have demonstrated the market's sensitivity to supply disruptions. Restricted navigation in the South China Sea is expected to cause significant fluctuations in oil prices, potentially reaching between $150 to $200 per barrel. This could lead to a monthly price increase of 390 to 940 billion yen, resulting in an additional monthly burden of at least 3,120 yen per person. The instability in oil supply also significantly affects stock prices. The 1973 oil crisis, for example, saw stock prices initially fall for 2 months, then recover, but later declined by about 10% for around 2 years. Anticipating similar economic impacts on the stock market in comparable scenarios is prudent. Japan's 2022 crude oil imports primarily came from Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Ecuador, Bahrain, Oman, the United States, Russia, and others. If imports from these countries become untenable, Japan may have to consider alternative sources, such as Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei. However, if the South China Sea becomes unnavigable, sourcing oil from these Southeast Asian countries would become challenging. Japan's oil reserves, lasting almost 240 days as of 2021, could provide a buffer for about half a year in such circumstances. China and Southeast Asian countries facing the South China Sea. China, heavily reliant on maritime transport for nearly 90% of its oil imports, would face severe logistical challenges if VLCCs cannot navigate the South China Sea. The alternative route through the Indonesian archipelago, then northward through the Western Pacific, and finally through the southwestern islands into the East China Sea, becomes the only viable option. However, if China establishes an area denial zone, the passage of VLCCs through the southwestern islands becomes militarily unfeasible, especially if the United States adopts strategies similar to offshore control. This scenario would also significantly impact Southeast Asian countries with coastlines on the South China Sea, leading to disruptions in their maritime transport networks. However, oil-producing nations like Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei might experience lesser impacts compared to China due to their local oil resources. The potential difficulties faced by container ships navigating these waters would have far-reaching consequences for the global economy. While this paper primarily focuses on VLCCs transporting crude oil from the Middle East to East Asia, expanding the scope to include container ships reveals that disruptions in logistics through the South China Sea would have even more severe economic repercussions. Many container hub ports are located along this vital sea route, and significant disruptions in these waters could lead to substantial turmoil in global trade and supply chains. Effectiveness and acceptability of the offshore control strategy. The offshore control strategy, proposed by the United States, is envisioned as a form of economic warfare against China, incorporating long-distance blockades leveraging geopolitical advantages. This strategy aims to disrupt China's import of energy resources and raw materials and its exports. By declaring the continental side of the first island chain as an exclusive maritime zone and deploying attack submarines, mines, and limited air power, it aims to deter large cargo ships and tankers. Additionally, in coordination with allies, it seeks to secure maritime and aerial superiority on the Pacific side of the first island chain and close strategic routes like the Malacca and Singapore Straits, the Lombok Strait, the Sunda Strait, and routes around Australia, effectively cutting off China's maritime transport. This strategy is not aimed at achieving a traditional decisive victory but focuses on effectively accomplishing specific goals. According to strategist TX Homis, by avoiding direct attacks on mainland China, the offshore control aims to prevent escalation to nuclear war and persuade China that settling the conflict is the more prudent course of action. The strategy presupposes that a war with China would likely be prolonged to avoid nuclear conflict, thus compelling China to consider ending the conflict without exhausting American military resources. Even if Chinese ships reroute via alternative paths like the Panama Canal, the Magellan Strait, or the Arctic route, the United States could potentially control these passages. Without escort by combat ships, navigating from east to west through the first island chain would be practically impossible. If the United States responds to China's area denial declaration in the South China Sea by implementing offshore control, the Chinese economy could face severe consequences. In a heightened conflict scenario in the South China Sea threatening the safety of sea lanes, China would likely bear the most significant economic losses. However, the prolonged nature of offshore control operations would inevitably have a substantial impact on the global economy. As a result, the economic losses for American allies like the Philippines and friendly nations such as Vietnam could be considerable. This raises significant challenges in supporting these countries while maintaining the offshore control strategy. Furthermore, if offshore control leads to the economic paralysis of China, disputes over control of sea routes in the region extending from the eastern Indian Ocean through the Malacca and Singapore Straits to the South China Sea are inevitable. Such a situation could escalate into a conflict typified by a 2/AD versus air-sea battle strategies. Thus, while offshore control may be an effective strategy, its acceptability and implications pose significant challenges, especially in scenarios where the South China Sea sea lanes are under threat. Personal recommendations for sea lane security policy. Reaffirming the importance of the sea lanes along the southeastern edge of the Eurasian continent, it's clear that these routes are not only vital for the global economy but also crucial for Japan's energy resource transportation. Oil tankers from the Middle East to Japan typically converge in the Indian Ocean, then pass through the Malacca and Singapore Straits before navigating the South China Sea. In this region, due to disputes over island ownership and seabed resource rights, primarily involving China, and the lack of agreements like the Incident at Sea Agreement or the Code of Unplanned Encounters at Sea, the risk of accidental armed conflicts is significant. Even sporadic armed conflicts in the South China Sea, or their escalation into intentional, prolonged conflicts between nations, could endanger these sea lanes, potentially leading to their partial or complete blockade. The sea lanes that traverse the South China Sea connect to the East China Sea via the Bashi Channel or the Taiwan Strait, sometimes extending to the Western Pacific. In the East China Sea, particularly near the Senkaku Islands, frequent confrontations occur between Japanese and Chinese maritime law enforcement vessels. Moreover, in the Western Pacific, the increasing presence of Chinese naval vessels appears to challenge the U.S. Navy's dominance. As such, conflicts in the South China Sea could potentially extend to the East China Sea, influenced by the adversarial dynamics between the United States, China, and Japan. Faced with the closure of the South China Sea sea lanes, Japan would encounter significant challenges in securing its oil and energy needs, in addition to managing economic losses and preventing the spread of conflict to the East China Sea. Addressing these challenges requires a comprehensive and multifaceted approach, encompassing both strategic defense measures and diplomatic efforts. Here are some recommendations for Japan's sea lane security policy. 1. Ensuring required vessels and energy resources. Japan must be prepared for scenarios where oil tankers are rerouted away from traditional paths like the Malacca and Singapore Straits. This necessitates a rapid acquisition of additional VLCCs to maintain a steady supply of oil. Given the potential for a sudden increase in demand and corresponding rise in chartering costs, Japan should explore agreements or contracts that allow for quick access to additional vessels when needed. Diversifying the sources of oil imports is also crucial. Japan should explore alternative suppliers beyond the Middle East, potentially including regions like the Americas, Russia, or even closer Southeast Asian countries. This strategy not only addresses immediate logistical challenges but also contributes to long-term energy security. 2. Stabilizing the security environment in the South China Sea. Preventing accidental armed conflicts at sea, which are a likely cause of navigation restrictions in the South China Sea, is essential. Japan should actively participate in and, where possible, lead efforts to establish maritime collision avoidance agreements and codes of conduct with other nations, especially those involved in the South China Sea disputes. Building trust and mutual understanding of international maritime law is key to these efforts. Strengthening regional security cooperation is vital for maintaining stability in the South China Sea. Japan should advocate for and engage in multilateral security dialogues and partnerships, aiming to create a stable and peaceful maritime environment that benefits all parties involved. 3. Defending maritime trade routes. The defense of sea lanes is crucial not only for VLCCs but for all maritime traffic, including container ships and bulk carriers. Japan should review and enhance its maritime defense strategies to protect these essential trade routes. This involves deploying self-defense forces as necessary and working closely with international partners, maritime law enforcement agencies, and private shipping companies to ensure the safety and security of these waterways. Japan's legal framework governing the self-defense forces' actions in scenarios like accidental armed conflicts in the South China Sea should be re-evaluated and updated to reflect the current geopolitical realities. This includes addressing the complexities of collective self-defense and ensuring that Japan's response capabilities are both legally sound and operationally effective. In conclusion, the security of sea lanes in the South China Sea is of paramount importance, not just for Japan but for the international community at large. It is imperative that Japan adopts a proactive and strategic approach, combining defense preparedness with diplomatic initiatives, to ensure uninterrupted access to these crucial maritime routes. These efforts are essential not only for Japan's energy security and economic stability but also for upholding the principles of free navigation and international cooperation in one of the world's key maritime regions. Conclusion. As we conclude our exploration of the complex and dynamic geopolitical situation in the South China Sea, it's evident that the outcomes of these maritime conflicts and strategic maneuvers hold significant implications not only for regional stability but also for global economic and political landscapes. The intricate interplay of national interests, security concerns, and international law in this crucial maritime region underscores the importance of continued vigilance, diplomatic efforts, and strategic thinking by all parties involved. This ongoing situation requires a keen understanding of international relations and a commitment to peaceful resolutions, reminding us of the delicate balance that governs our interconnected world. That's it for today's video. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications. Feel free to share parts of this video as long as you provide a clear link to this video and our channel. Our goal is to spread knowledge about Japan to people all around the world, so please use this content freely. However, if you intend to monetize using our content, we may request a portion of the earnings. Using this content maliciously is strictly prohibited. Moreover, we cannot compensate for any disadvantages or issues arising from the use of this content.